Welcome to our webinar today, Making a Difference Through Smart Government Relations. I'm Joanne Geer. I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project. And I'm first going to introduce you to Michael Welling, who is a co-founder. And would you like to say a few words, Michael?
You were right.
Absolutely.
Hold on.
Nope. Thank you, Joanne. Welcome, everyone. This is Michael Welling. I want to take an opportunity first to thank you for joining us today. I am very excited for today's conversation, personally and professionally, as I've known our speakers in both regards. When we set out with the Westchester Biotech Project just 14 months ago, and many of you may have heard me say this, our goal was to figure out the most effective ways that we could make a difference and an impact both throughout our local community, but also on the global community as it relates to biotech and healthcare and medical research. Lisa, who is joining us today, who you'll meet in a moment, there's no one I know who is a stronger advocate in that regard or a more brilliant strategist in determining both how to steward organizations and efforts forward. She's going to be a real asset to us as she leads us in our efforts on our government affairs efforts. And today is just an introduction and a launch. And I encourage everyone who's listening today to get comfortable, take some notes, and sort of be prepared to jump on board the Lisa train as she takes us moving forward. So Lisa and Matthew, thank you very much. And Joanne, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. So if anybody hears sirens in the background, where my office is, they test the fire alarms on Wednesday, and they test them a lot. So just in case that's what it is, there are no problems. We are very happy to welcome Lisa Wickens-Alteri and Matthew McLarnon to speak today. They have, Capital Health Consulting has become one of our community partners, and this is, as Michael said, this is sort of a new thing for us to really think about how to really work with our relationships with government, and so we're very interested in today's program as well. Just going to tell you a little bit about ourselves. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're really all about we're based in Westchester County, New York, which is just north of New York City, and everyone in our region who is a researcher or an engineer or a data scientist is likely to be doing some amount of collaboration, if not regionally, nationally and internationally. So a lot of what we're doing is unearthing what some of those exciting relationships are and really working to enhance them on an international basis and really raise awareness of what's going on in our community and the international research community. As you see, we're doing all of the social media, and any help anybody wants to give us is much appreciated. I won't go into detail on these, but we have a number of different programs. This Innovation in Research is our annual regional come show each other what you're working on kind of program. We just had our rare disease symposium last week, in fact, which is a launch for a major effort to build a rare disease research hub as a soft landing for international researchers to come to our area. The Tauopathy Colloquium is likely to be in the spring at Burke Neurological Institute. On this lower left is our represents our Young Investigators program, which is focused on the kinds of things they don't teach you in school for PhD postdoc era scientists through about age 40. You know, it's hard to become a scientist, and it's even harder to remain one. So we like to give as much support as we can. Our consortium on translational research in the microbiome is a collaboration with Kean University, City University of New York, and a number of other institutions, including NIST. Our focus is on addressing harmonization of research methods and enabling technologies in microbiome research. So it's a nice, juicy topic there. And we're very excited that there's actually a group in Europe who's interested in starting a Westchester Biotech Project node, and we're working on our MOU right now. But just to see that we're already having a draw from across the pond. our work is made possible through many different partners, and I just want to share with you our appreciation of all of these different organizations, smaller and larger, and we really work through developing annual partnerships so that we really think about what we can do to help our partners in the course of them helping us. So I'm going to be turning it over now to Lisa, and I'm going to mute myself, and you can unmute yourself, and off we go.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Joanne, for the introduction, and thank you, Michael, for your kind words, as always. Capital Health Consulting is a government relations and consulting firm with, we are clinicians by background. We are not scientists, but we are clinicians, and our expertise is government. We actually have more than 100 years combined government experience throughout the staff in our office. So with that being said, we're based right here in Albany. I am going to turn it over to Matthew to start our webinar.
Thank you, Lisa. If we could go 2 more slides, Joanne, to what are government relations? Yes, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for the introduction. If we could go back with once. Yeah, right there. Thank you. We have a little bit of technical difficulty, so please bear with me as I try and manage this.
Matthew, there seems to be a bit of a lag, but yeah, you just give me the ping and I will continue on.
Okay, great. So when starting to talk about government relations, I really like to start about what government relations are not. I feel as though there's a big sort of misconception about what goes into lobbying and advocating for certain business interests. And while people may picture that lobbyists or government relations teams are people who stuff politicians' pockets with the money of special interest groups or offer a person of power a job for the relative in exchange for moving legislation to serve that client's business, this is a huge misconception. And unfortunately, for a lot of people's imagination, government relation isn't something that you find in a movie plot. In fact, here in New York State is a highly scrutinized profession regulated by the state's Public Ethics Commission. And while many people don't understand our role and find that maybe an investment in a government relations team may be a waste, I would instead liken us to insurance, where you'll always question why you need it, but when you do, you're sure glad that it's actually there. Now, government relations, and if we could slide, please. Government relations is a core function of a business operation to promote and protect the interests that best serve your business. Whether that's through grassroots advocacy, policy analysis, political strategy, or communications, these are just a handful of services in the scope of government relations. Now, government relations professionals walk a two-way street. If we could slide again. At one end of the street, we educate policymakers, and at the other, we keep our stakeholders informed of legislative risks and opportunities. Ultimately, we act as a member of your team that is looking out for your interests so you can keep 100% of your focus on the development and operations of your business. Now, a lot of people question at this point, who knows my interests better than me? Who knows my business better than I do? And that's not what government relations is. We don't come into your operation and try to tell you what you know you've been doing for as many years as you've been doing it. So where I wouldn't come in to your business and I wouldn't know where to start in explaining what HLL system corresponds to what class of MHC protein complex, the same thing could be reversed in our state, where you couldn't tell me where to start in drafting legislation and whom the appropriate committee chair would be referred in that piece of legislation. And that's where it comes down to a little bit of teamwork. If we get the next slide. So communication is especially important and is a major component of what goes into successful government relation operations in New York State. I'm just looking at this slide, you can see that there are 63 members of the Assembly, 150 members of the Assembly, 63 members of the Senate, giving you 200 plus members to work with on moving pieces of legislation or sort of getting attention to an issue that you might find important to your business. Now, clear communication between contracting parties allows for a clear path to know how to craft the stakeholders' priorities and how best to deliver that message to legislative and regulatory bodies. When we talk about the legislative branch, often people are just concerned about who's in their backyard, who's my assemblyman, who's my senator, they're going to take up my issue, and that's that. But looking at 200 members, we really have to see the bigger picture. If you go to the next slide, please. Often to the surprise of many from outside of New York State, and to some people here in our own state, there is importance to looking outside of New York City. And just because your business is located within a member's district does not mean that your business is a priority for that member. Now, for an example, my example would be that a few years ago I was working with a fellow lobbyist who had a group in the capital area region who dealt in developmental disabilities. And they had set up a meeting with the local assemblyman to come and speak to these families who were taking care of their children on a daily basis. Now, this certain legislator has a unique personality, but in the process of meeting with these parents, he announced to them that developmental disabilities was not a priority for him, that jobs, lowering taxes, increasing education were more on the top of his list than trying to find funding for these families in upstate New York. So while at that point, many people, many organizations will say, well, if this person's not willing to help me, who will? And what ended up happening was we went to an assemblyman from Long Island, out of Long Beach, who was a true champion for this issue and ended up being able to help them gain funding through the state. So when you're thinking about your business, and specifically in the Westchester biotech region, you may instead need to look elsewhere for a champion in your industry, to carry your legislation, to carry the economic development initiatives that you wish, and then maybe looking back in your backyard when you're looking for secure state monies for something like a member item. And it's for all these reasons that corporations, foundations, and organizations employ the help of government relations to advocate on their behalf. Now, let's work our way back to the biotechnology and how government relations plays a role. Next slide, please. So where does biotechnology fit? And this is kind of a very broad topic. While the focus of this webinar is on life sciences and why early stage companies may find government relations useful, it doesn't hurt to list the names like Lockheed Martin, Monsanto, and Pfizer, who all work in the biotech space and maintain a large cap for government relations. So rather than explaining where biotech fits in, I think our time would be better spent looking specifically at a piece of legislation where government relations would play a role. Next slide. While federally, biotech companies are focused on NIH funding and the FDA and intellectual property and patent reform, the state presents its own legislative challenges, whether that being Medicaid drug caps, prescriber prevails, or updating statute just simply to reflect advancements in technologies that have given the medical space such things as biologic therapies. Now, to bring you an example, I took a specific piece of legislation that deals in drug takebacks. Now, one important thing to take into consideration is that there can be, in New York State, over 10,000 pieces of legislation introduced in the 2-year span and 2-year legislative cycle. And a lot of these bills will often have similarities. So in this case, I took a bill on your left, S6750 from Hannon, to the same sponsor. And under this bill that was vetoed earlier this year by Governor Cuomo, it required that chain pharmacies operate a safe disposal site for for basically essentially just their drug take-back program. Under the explanation, it was to prevent teens from sort of developing drug habits because they were able to easily access their parents' prescriptions. Now, that piece of legislation was vetoed by Governor Cuomo as it gave no burden, shared burden by the manufacturer to take care of the drugs being returned. Now, a year later, in the same legislative cycle, Hannon introduces another bill, the Drug Take-Back Act. Same thing, required pharmacies to maintain a system to collect prescription drugs. It was drafted, in this case, in response to the opioid addiction crisis. And in this bill, it required that manufacturers pay all the administrative and operational fees associated with the program. Now, this ran into its own hiccup. It was unable to find a corresponding sponsor in the New York State Assembly, which is necessary for the bill to ultimately get to the governor's office where he will sign it into law. Now, this could be because the manufacturer had a lobbyist who had convinced an assemblyman not to be able to sign on due to language that was sort of, it would inhibit their business in New York. And it's really important to take this into consideration because while you're focused on running your business and working to come up with innovative solutions to anywhere in whatever field you may be working in, government relations professionals are there to watch your back so that if you're the manufacturer, your concerns are taken into consideration when these bills are coming up to the floor. Now, the Drug Take-Back Act is just one example of legislation that can impact how businesses evaluate their presence in the state. Because at the end of the day, whether it is legislative or regulatory, if the environment is not friendly or more importantly profitable, companies will go elsewhere, and that is why organizations invest in government relations. Yet, it's not where government relations stops. They also play a role in economic development. Next slide, please. The state of New York has a long history of supporting scientific and technological innovation, establishing the Science and Technology Foundation in 1963 under the state's economic development umbrella organization, the Empire State Development Corp. The state has made a number of investments over the years to enhance life science research in New York State, and currently ranks third in funding received by NIH. Now, the state has made their own investments. Through such initiatives as Startup New York, the current administration has worked to make the state a more business-friendly environment. And while this program specifically has not yielded the anticipated engagement from businesses, government relations professionals across the state have lobbied to receive investments from the state into private-public projects. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, in just the last year's budget for 2018-2019, here are a number of different initiatives that were included to receive funding through the state of New York. You have a laboratory in Long Island. Hudson Institute received funding. Long Island University received funding. Clarkson received funding for an international partnership between Clarkson University and the Trudeau Institute. And in addition, another $620 million was allocated for life science research investment. This included a tax credit for the Excelsior Jobs Program. It included $100 million for life science research and development under a refundable tax credit program, and an additional $320 million to be allocated through state capital grants to support the development of wet lab and innovation space. Additionally, the state has committed to offering a public investment for those early stage life science companies that have been able to, that can leverage at least $100 million. Now, before I turn it over to Lisa to explain further examples of what her experience has brought her through her career, I would like to note that in just this past week, the Empire State Development awarded the IndieBio, a highly experienced and well-regarded accelerator, $25 million over the next 5 years through the Life Science Initiative support IndieBio's work, connecting science entrepreneurs with the tools and resources needed to move their discoveries out of the lab and into the marketplace. and government relations has played a role not only legislatively, but through economic development in New York State. And Lisa?
Yeah, thank you. Could we please go to the next slide? So I mentioned Matt had mentioned that, we expect in government relations to do a few things. We try to work with the experts to identify a possible problem and then come up with solutions and strategy to make that work. I'm a registered nurse by background, as is my vice president in our firm. We've worked in the Department of Health. And so we are clinicians that really want to see the right outcomes. So I'm going to walk through a few of the examples from some positive examples that we've had working with our firm. So the first one is Save Our Western New York Children's Psychiatric Center. This is actually a pediatric children's psych center that is out in Westchester, out in Western New York. And in 2016 and 2017, the executive budget proposed consolidation of inpatient mental health services in order to improve the dollars that were going towards community improvement and services that are very necessary. The positive aspects was that it included and increased home and community-based slots and services for the individuals based on where they lived. It also had dollars going towards mobile integration teams. So teams of experts that would go out to where an individual was having a problem, so they didn't have to go to an institutional setting. The positive was that the governor wanted to put more dollars into extending these services into the community. But the problem was, this was a small psychiatric hospital that was serving more than 17 counties and was delivering great outcomes. And it served a very, very vulnerable population of children ages 3 and up that had been abused by many adults. So the concerns that rose came from the family members that had seen their children in different institutions and ending up here at the Children's Psych Center to receive really positive treatment. And they had actually seen their children grow and live very positive lives. So those family members came and sought us out and asked if we could help find a solution. And the bottom line was, the solution is we just need to keep it open. Because the other side of this with the consolidation was to move the children from this very small, isolated psychiatric center to a large adult program, which was in downtown. So we identified the potential risks. We tried to come up with solutions and develop a strategy. So what were the risks? In talking to the families, the solution for them, the positives were the outcomes, children surviving and actually recovering. But the risks to the government was it would cost more money to keep 2 institutions separate. It would cost the government more money to modernize an outdated physical plant. And the jobs at both institutions, pediatric center as well as the adult center, were state jobs. So if we were to combine the 2 institutions, we would save money. So the risks were really, we were fighting dollars that the state was going to save to utilize money to improve community services. So the risks were, we knew that we had a lot of people that were supportive of the consolidation, and yet we had a small population that would benefit from the separation in a children's psychiatric center. So we started with talking to the legislature and the families and the children to identify the numbers of communities served, the quality outcomes, the awards, and started developing a message, identifying quality data that identified the outcomes and how this institution compared to others, not only in New York State, but across the country. Our messaging became what you see here, which is the hands of children that adorned the walls of the Pediatric Psychiatric Center. And we developed films, CDs, community and radio ads that were shared across the state. For year one, we kept the Children's Psychiatric Center open for 1 year. It was put on hold. Year two, the same thing happened. So families that had children in the Western Children's Psychiatric Center were really concerned. Are we going to keep having this fight every year? So we needed to shift and change our strategy. Our strategy was, how do we help the government meet the needs of the community, as well as meet the needs of the individuals and the children that are being served, and keep them from having to go into the adult psychiatric facility? The long and short of it is, we came up with a Center of Excellence project that the governor was very positive and wanted to have happen, but not in Western New York. So ultimately, we worked with the attorneys for the Western New York Children's Psychiatric Center, and I'm happy to report that today, Western Children's Psychiatric Center remains open as a facility that only serves children. Next slide. The next problem that we're all very familiar with is the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis really started we started seeing a lot more of it in New York State in the early 2000s. And by 2012, we were seeing more and more substance use disorders being diagnosed and people being addicted to prescription pain medications. The problem was starting to grow, and the legislature was starting to see and hear from more and more of their constituents asking for solutions. In some of the first discussions, we were asked if we would work with the legislature and bring together some of the personal stories that were happening in the communities to identify positive pieces of legislation that would address the growing numbers of overdoses and individuals diagnosed with substance use disorders. The first piece of legislation that came out was one piece of the strategy. Next slide. And you can go ahead and click for the next pieces to come up on the left-hand side. So ISTOP was the first piece of this solution. ISTOP was a piece of legislation that basically says, when you go to identify or prescribe a medication, prior to doing so as a physician or filling it as a pharmacist, you check to see if this individual patient has had a prescription filled recently. So what this did was this helped to stop or curb doctor shopping, to actually start to decrease the number of pills that were out on the streets. This actually was passed in 2012 and became effective in 2013. The issue with this is, just like Matt said, there's other pieces of legislation and different pieces that do have different outcomes. This piece of legislation, which was part of a solution, actually caused an unintended consequence. Because by doing this, we actually pretty much dried up the pain medications that were out on the streets. And although that was a good thing, the state advocates, parents realized that a much more comprehensive plan had to be developed. So we knew the problem was an epidemic. We knew that the strategy had to be very complex and had to be comprehensive. And not being the experts, we had to go out and identify what were the barriers and how were we going to deal with this issue. So the strategy was to go out to the experts. And the experts ranged from the individuals struggling with the disease, to the parents, to the clinicians, and to those people that were actually part of the, I would say, team, which were police and emergency rooms and hospitals. And the Senate started with holding hearings across the state to meet and listen to individual communities, families, to hear those in recovery, and in order to identify some of the barriers that were causing this problem and only feeding the numbers. The state actually very quickly, the Senate, identified a full report that was not just one piece of legislation, but was more than 14. And at the end of 2014, the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor all came forward passing 11 pieces of legislation. The pieces of legislation included not just allowing Narcan training and certification for individuals to carry Narcan, change and update education for all schools every 3 years based on the current drug of choice and the developmental levels of the children, change the insurance laws, reimburse medication-assisted treatment, extend coverage and time of services after inpatient and outpatient with treatment and support services, and to start to develop and reimburse for peer recovery coaches in the field. That's just to name a few. So what the problem was a problem that was evolving from the early 2000s until it started to come to light in 2011 and 12, to then moving to a full comprehensive plan that continues to be addressed year after year. Now, next slide, please. Going back to what government relations is and is not, is that government relations, lobbying, consulting, is working really in a lot of policy development for businesses, understanding what their business is and them telling us what is necessary and what the barriers are. So together as a team, we can try to develop solutions. Sometimes those solutions require legislation. Sometimes those solutions really require working with communities, clinicians, researchers, to identify ways in which we can collaborate and bring solutions to New York State. So the next example is an example that is in regards to neurodegenerative diseases, but it really started back in 1998 with advocates coming to the New York State Department of Health about Huntington's disease. And the problem really was that individuals living with Huntington's disease or Huntington's chorea were only being cared for by one facility in New York State, and then in certain beds across the state, but not well. And a number of individuals living in New York State moved to Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania to receive care for Huntington's disease. That meant many, many people were actually without their families. Nursing homes weren't willing to take these individuals, and we slowly started to identify that the barriers were, the behaviors of some of these individuals were difficult, there were too many risks to care for them, and they just didn't have the ability to do a good job. So in 1998 and 1999, a set of regulations were developed by the New York State Department of Health and presented to the Public Health and Health Planning Council for adoption. And they were actually denied. They were not adopted because the Public Health and Health Planning Council at the time felt that a specialty regulations for one disease did not make sense in medical care and treatment. So as time moved on, a number of residents and individuals living in New York State continued to increase, and advocates went to the governor's office as well as the Department of Health, speaking about the increased numbers of individuals with Huntington's disease, as well as more and more individuals being diagnosed with ALS and some of the other neurodegenerative diseases. So fast forward, we had a group, individuals from the Huntington's Disease Society of America, as well as some of the parents and individual advocates in the communities come and speak to our firm. And one of the things that was raised was that they needed specialty regulations and rates so that their loved ones didn't have to go out of state to receive the care they needed. We identified the problem, and the solution was we started with going back and identifying all the barriers that we mentioned before, and went to the governor's office. With the changes and the increase in diagnosis and understanding and education that was in the clinical field, there was now more momentum and more focus on ALS and some of the other neurodegenerative diseases. So in speaking with the governor's office, instead of writing regulations for just Huntington's disease, maybe it made the most sense to create regulations and programming to care for individuals that had neurodegenerative diseases. Now, this took a lot of work in talking to family members to identify those that would be against it, as well as those that would be for it, along with the number of clinicians that would do the same. With the Department of Health and the governor's office, a neurodegenerative task force or work group was actually developed. And even though people said it would never happen, within 2 years, new regulations were developed not only to identify programming that would be required in specialty units in nursing homes in New York State, but specialty regulations for rate reimbursement would also be put in place. They have been adopted, and today we have 2 facilities right now caring for individuals with neurodegenerative diseases, and 2 more on the way to care for these individuals. This means that a number of people that may have had to go out of state can now stay in state, or some of those individuals that would like to come back can do so. So these are just a couple of examples of the ways in which our firm has worked with businesses, clinical folks, to actually identify solutions. And some of them have happened over years, and some of them have happened rather quickly in regards, and comparing 2 years to 5 or 6 years. But it's a strategy, it's a process, and it's a team effort. So with that being said, I think we'll see if there's any questions. Next slide.
Thank you very, very much. I have a couple of questions to get started with, and those who are listening can feel free to enter a question in the chat box, and we'll share it with everyone. Or we have a very small group here, so if you're interested, say you'd like to be recognized, and we'll invite you to say a few words that everyone can hear. So I would like to hear you talk about patients. I think, and first I want to put a little disclaimer. So this is Joanne Geer again, Executive Director of the Westchester Biotech Project. And I will say that we do not have it in our charter to do lobbying. And so we are not doing lobbying. However, we feel it's very important for those of us in this wonderful and complex industry to have a good understanding of every part of the matrix. And so that's one reason I'm excited to be working with with Lisa and Matthew and their team is that I think that we can share as a resource their perspective. And so I just wanted to say that this is a working, living relationship. So we can work together if there are deeper questions we'd like to go into or get into discussion of specific legislation or hoped for legislation, et cetera, we can have ongoing forums about that. So that said, Lisa, would you talk about patience? I'll just add one more thing, which is the quote it's from Bill Gates, and it's people overestimate what they can accomplish in 1 year and underestimate what they can accomplish in 10 years. And they give up 5 years in, right? So I'll sit back and listen to you for a moment, Lisa. What are your thoughts?
Now, when you say patience, you mean patience not regarding the people that we actually care for, but the patience in working with and doing government relations.
The patience with the process. You know, it seems that someone in your role has to be diligent about opportunities and ready to pounce when they arrive, but extremely patient about the process, or else you'd go a little nuts. Am I experiencing that the right way? Am I imagining it the right way?
You are. And I think I'll give you another example, and I'll try to answer the question. So, you know, one of the things that we try to do when we're meeting with clients and we're sitting down with businesses, trying to identify what their goal is. So once we identify their goal and we come up with the strategy with them, we have to try to manage how long it's going to take. And you know, I wish we had a crystal ball. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And the other issue is that we are actually, we have the benefit of working with actual live clinicians, scientists, and individuals, pharmacology, you know, pharmacy groups, and you know, they really do have someone at the other end that they want to serve and make an improvement for. So they're overly excited and anxious to get it done. And one example I have is I actually had an individual mom that called me with a problem, and the problem was we didn't have any pediatric ventilator beds in New York State, and she needed to keep her child in her state, in New York, and not move them to New Jersey. And so it sounded like, oh, an easy solution. We'll just get a bed and we'll just make it happen. And so here we had a mother, and our whole, the lobbying effort was really for this one individual, but for all the other kids that were living longer because of medicine advancements. And so it was, you know, part of the team, part of the piece that we actually add with our clients is we stay in constant communication, and we try to help manage each other's expectations and always be reaching out to identify what is happening in the environment around us that we can actually grab onto and maybe push our agenda or push the solution a little bit, you know, make it a little bit more timely for the individual. For the one case that I'm referring to, the one patient, we actually, you know, we did find a unit that was specifically for pediatrics in a couple of years. But in the meantime, we came up with short-term solutions for that individual. That's what we try to do on a business side as well. So we develop short-term and long-term solutions. So I hope that answered your questions. Matt, do you have anything else to add to that in regards to patients?
Yeah, I think I like the quote by Bill Gates in that, you know, things don't necessarily happen just overnight. Looking at New York State and pieces of legislation over the past couple decades that you can really use as examples, and these are none of these. Well, specifically this example I'm going to present is not something that we're currently advocating for, but I'm sure very many people are aware of the single-payer healthcare system, or a lot of people sometimes, depending on how you define it, Medicare for all. In New York State, the prime sponsor of that bill, Dick Godfrey, has had that bill for 20 plus years, just to give an idea of, the types of policy that are out there that really, really probably at this point are straining patients. Something Godfrey is probably just a few years away from retiring, and he may never see a single payer system get to the governor's desk. Similar situation could be said with medical marijuana or gay marriage in New York State. All of these things took time, and I think that's something to take into consideration, because I think the last thing that people are when it comes to their business and getting it done is patient. And I think trying to communicate that it really is a process is important. And I really enjoyed that Bo Gates quote. I think it really puts it in a nice way.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And we have a question from our listeners. And I will say, I know there's a number of people involved with the drug development process, which is, 15 years and just, $1 billion or so. And so the idea that, oh my gosh, now I have to be knowledgeable about my science, my interactions in my company, the commercialization of my science, all different aspects of it, and I have to think about how to work with the government. And so we'll be exploring this a little bit more over the coming year, but we may be able to unearth some ideas that folks have been working on for some time. Actually, our Rare Disease Research Institute is one of those things that our champion, Antonio Molina, has been trying to make something happen for years, and we think that we actually may have an opportunity to work together and realize it. 2 years or 10 years, however many it takes. The question we have is from Keith Safian, who is the co-chair of our Virtual Executive in Residence program, which is available when people have, a question and don't even know where to start to look for the answer. You can get in touch with us and we'll help you find somebody who can give you a little bit of time and at least give you some background or get you started in the right direction. And we have a wonderful range, dozens of professionals in all different areas in the science, in the business side that are available to you. Anyway, Keith's question: can a biotech firm lobby for funding to support their product development for a particular disease?
Yeah. So I guess the question is, are you actually looking for funding for a specific building? Is it going to be, it really depends on how it's couched. So I guess the question is, one of the
things that a therapeutic or a diagnostic or a device of some sort, those might be a little different on each one, but the idea that the target is a single disease, I guess, is the question. Yeah.
So going back to the example that I shared before, that was to try to get increased funding to care for patients with a specific disease. I think the answer is probably, most firms in this, most firms that do what we do, what our firm does is we not only try to come up with ways to identify possible dollars that are maybe available in federal and different levels of grants, but sometimes it's talking to the legislature or the government to identify maybe there's an RFP or an RFA or something that the state would want to look into to put out there to actually develop a project or some solutions for that disease, or maybe it's all about strategy. So I'm trying to kind of think of ideas right now off the top of my head, but that's how we would approach it. So we'll say just for an example, like the Huntington's disease, that was an idea to come up with dollars and specialized services for those individuals. But then 10 years passed, maybe it would have been less than that, identifying that the number of diseases, or there's a different way, a medical advancement or another idea on how to come up with a grant opportunity, that could be presented to the state. So they would possibly put out an RFA or an RFP to do something for a specific disease or a category of them.
Great question. Thank you, Keith. So the and we're just starting to get our arms around the various funding mechanisms that have been announced by the state. And those of you, if you haven't already heard it, we have on our YouTube channel a webinar we did a few weeks ago with Loretta Bine from the Empire State Development, and discussing the different tax benefits, but also a piece that, to me, if you're talking about the evolution of an idea to make it work, you know, to be able to get something that actually makes a difference. And I will just share what I took away from that webinar was that in, you know, a lot of the state benefits, there's a mythical $600 and some million, and about half of it is in things like tax benefits and the other is in cash. Okay, that's still a lot of cash. And you went through a number of the places where that's starting to trickle through. One of the pieces that has changed in this journey while they're figuring out actually how to make it work, and I respect that they're taking their time to figure out how to make it work, is that it used to be that if you were to get certain benefits, you would have to create 5 jobs, right? Mm-hmm. And somewhere the right communication occurred to say, you know what, a life science company may create no jobs, and it may create no jobs for a long time, and then it may create thousands of jobs, right? And so they've actually dropped that provision so that there isn't, and then now I don't want to, you know, it's not for, may not be for every program, but for the ones that were being discussed at that moment, they had dropped that provision. So what I liked about hearing that story was hearing the state actually listen to its constituency as a process was unfolding, and also that there was somebody there to answer the question, to speak up. So I'm going to sort of put a pin in that, but I'm already getting ideas, Lisa and Matthew, about things we might want to do in future programs. Let's see if is there anyone who would like to add anything, share anything, ask another question? Oops, I have one question. Okay, Chris Kenzel is our West Coast Associate for Communication, who really makes a lot of things happen. So Chris, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, hi, thanks, Joanne. I'll make this quick. We have 2 other good questions below as well. So am I correct? This is kind of am I correct in saying that raising public awareness and kind of generating these advocacy groups is just as important as talking to legislature in a sense of kind of rallying the troops? I guess the question is, will legislature even listen to you if there's not a big enough outcry?
That's a great question. And I think that's part of, you know, kind of building your strategy. You know, going back to the Huntington's disease, there were 1 or 2 parents that were going to the Department of Health and the governor's office about the disease. And part of our job is really to identify, you know, who are the other people that are out there being affected. In many of these diseases, or we'll say business issues that come up, people don't know that there's other people out there that have the same issues. And so that's why I was making the point earlier that government relations is really sometimes like policy development. You're really identifying how big of the problem it is and trying to help build, you know, that advocacy group, get them to talk together, and identify. And by doing that, you're really getting a better picture of what the overall barriers are, and it also helps when they're going together.
Yeah, and I'm going to add on to that, and you don't necessarily.
I'm sorry, Matthew. You need to get a little closer to the microphone. You sound like you're at the bottom of the well. There we go.
Yeah. So you don't necessarily. Well, public advocacy is definitely vital importance. It's not necessary that you need it in order to approach the legislature. Well, I want to give you a specific example on this, and that is special ed pre-K. They do not receive a whole lot of funding. And when you look at that age group, you're looking at children between the ages of, I believe, 2 to 4. So it's not very often that you'll find a parent to, you know, spend the time over the next 2 years, because then eventually their kid's out of preschool and it no longer is their problem. What you can do when you do lack public advocacy on that end is try to identify an advocate within the legislature that's willing to take up your issue and really run with it. The example I had before with the legislator from upstate New York who didn't support developmental disability funding, there was a champion from Long Island that did. And that can often be found as, while developmental disabilities do have a good advocacy group, you do often find that there will be a champion that will carry you for your region despite your local elected not wanting to do that, or not being a priority, really.
Yeah,
So
I really agree that it's I want to move us on to some. We have several questions, so I'm going to move us on. Thank you, Matthew. But I really agree that it takes a champion. There need to be a lot of people that care, but there do need to be, a few people up front that are really steadfast in working these things through. Let's see, I have a new question. So do you see biopharma companies becoming more active in developing solutions and driving legislative changes, or is it driven more by other stakeholders, such as patient advocacy groups, which you somewhat addressed? If the latter, assuming the legal and regulatory barriers, are there specific gaps that could be addressed to get industry more involved in developing solutions? So I guess the question is there more room for biopharma companies to be part of the solution?
So I'm going to just give you, yes, there definitely is. I think part of going back to education, going back to having one of our first pieces of things that I'm so tired. One of the first things that we try to do is actually try to educate people on this. And so I think the answer is yes. And then creating the way in which you deliver it is the other piece of this. Talking to people that understand you both in the legislature, as well as we haven't really talked about the executive branch. So not just the governor's office, but the agencies, whether it be the Department of Health, whether it be, the Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services, or financial services. So we have all those different areas to go to create a strategy on how to develop and move things forward. So, through all of this, it's really educating people to identify the need for it. And I think the answer is most certainly yes, as more and more individuals and the general public is more aware of what's out there and what the possibilities are in the future for some real solutions.
Yeah, definitely. If you're looking at New York State statute, it's definitely not up to date with sort of the technological advancements that have been happening. Just for a quick example, biosimilars. Pharmacists were not allowed to prescribe biologic therapies until this past year, while they were allowed to substitute, because biologic therapies was actually missing, or biologic product was missing from the actual law, and there was no definition for it. Pharmacists were not allowed to substitute those in. So there's definitely a lot of room for Biopharm to come into New York State and really bring them up to speed as to what advancements are going on and what statutes in the law are kind of inhibiting them from providing innovative solutions.
Well, great. We have another question. This is from Laura Green at the Hudson Institute. Thank you for joining us. Laura has done some wonderful webinars in our Young Investigators series on communicating as a scientist, communicating science to other scientists as well as to the general public. Her question is, you mentioned your work with a patient client. Let's say you have a patient with a rare disease, motivated but under-resourced. What do you recommend patients do to start the conversation? As a scientist, how can I best support the patient and help connect them to a body that will help create change?
That's a great question. I guess it would start with what we were talking about before, which is, first of all, what the disease is, what other, you say rare disease, and from what we're learning is rare means less than 10,000. Is that what we had said, or 5,000? But I do believe if there's similar types of diseases out there. That's kind of what we've done in regards to the neurodegeneratives and some of the other diseases that we've worked on. And it's actually starting to actually have the conversation to identify, what is it that you need. You said resources and funding. it be educating specific people in the legislature or in the state to actually start to have the conversation. It could be sitting down and talking to someone in Wadsworth Labs. It could be, you know, there's lots of different places to start.
I think if you're working as a self-advocate, you know, you want to start in your backyard, identifying local legislators that are at the state level and even the federal level, and going to them and, you know, working with their constituent relations to, you know, identify resources in the community, and really, if they're not familiar, to help educate them and look for, you know, a strategy to have continuous meetings to really bring awareness to that disease space.
Well, I'm going to turn the spotlight on one of our audience members. I apologize that we can't get to all of the questions, but I'm going to be sharing them with Lisa and Matthew, and they may be able to follow up with you with some notes. But Margie Wilkie is teasing us by saying you have a scientific suggestion for lobbying, and I'm going to invite you to share it. I'm not sure what that sounds. Hi there.
Hi. So I just wanted to say that there are sort of 3 levels of ways to grow the class, because what you did with the Huntington's was to increase the size of the class to neurology diseases. And the low-level way of increasing the class is to find all the people in the class. So genealogy is maybe the best way of doing that for these rare diseases, and because we're talking to a rare disease group here. And the second way is, let's see, genealogy, then look in the pathway. So there are multiple genes within a pathway that will cause a disease. For instance, Parkinson's disease is not just one gene in the pathway. And then the third way is to, and you can go on that second way, you can go to companies like Ingenuity Systems, who has pathway information. And many other ways. There are many other ways to build the pathways. The third thing is to look at ontologies, and that's ontology with a T, not a C. So you look at tree structures. So you can start out with diseases, and then there are diseases caused by bacteria, diseases caused by viruses, and genetic diseases. And then you look at neurological diseases, and you work your way down, or you work your way up, really. You find, say, the Huntington's disease, and then you go find other diseases that are related to it, or the next thing up, which is neurological diseases, and so on. So those ontologies are a quick way of looking to grow your class size without, you know, maybe you don't want to go all the way to neurology. Maybe you want to just get diseases that cause, violent outbreaks. You know, that kind of thing. So ontologies are a good way, and you can just Google that and find the medical ontologies or disease ontologies or genetic ontologies. So that was all.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and I think that we are going to have some fun getting under the hood, and potentially, I'm just going to put it out there, and we'll talk some more about this, but I think if we can help Lisa identify an interesting question, perhaps Lisa can counsel us on how we can support a solution. So
yes.
Okay, good. So everybody in the boat. I really want to thank both of you. Lisa and Matthew, would you do any final comments you'd like to make before we all part today?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to actually have this webinar. We're just trying to really give an overview of kind of how this is part of a team solution. So we appreciate the time and attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending. Thanks to Chris Kinzel. In a few days, we'll have the recording posted on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to share it if you like. Thank you so much. Take care.